The story begins with the devil Rickesia walking down the street. She was the queen of the underground world and the most beautiful flower of the empire. Wherever she appeared, she left an intoxicating aroma that no one could confuse with anything. Her red eyes, which resembled thorny roses, remained forever in the memory of those who saw them, and they gave her the nickname Devil for a reason. It was all because of her character. The Rexasia was sharp and merciless, like the thorns of a rose, and without hesitation destroyed anyone who stood in its way. In the underground world, she was feared and at the same time admired for her beauty and incredible power. But unexpectedly, Rexasia, who had been the main topic of gossip in the empire, disappeared without a trace. Her disappearance caused much gossip, as no one was able to solve the mystery of her unexpected disappearance. Most believed that she had been secretly kidnapped by the Inquisition and imprisoned in the dungeons of the Vatican. This was not surprising, because the Orthodox world wanted to get rid of this devil. Some believed that she had been eaten by a predatory flower, because after such an end, it was unlikely that anyone would find her remains. But no one could come close to the truth, and even if they did, no one could believe such a delusion, because even Rickesia herself couldn't believe it. Examining her own body and touching her cheek, the little girl said that she didn't expect things to go this far. The most beautiful woman in the world, a narcissistic thief, and the culprit of all the scandals and most high-profile crimes of the empire, had turned into a 5-year-old girl. It was difficult to believe and accept this reality. Now the angry Rickesia could not find a way out of the situation, and indignantly looked at her reflection in the mirror. At the same time, she swore so much that if anyone heard these words, they would immediately lose consciousness. And it was no accident that she found herself in such a situation, and it all started a month ago. While discussing the latest news with her assistant, she asked if Count Basilion's family really secretly wanted to take the child from the orphanage. The male animal, which resembled a dog in appearance, was named Hata. He was Richezia's assistant and informant. Hata happily said that the head of the Basilian family was hiding his identity and secretly visiting orphanages. Hata was the thief Rickezia's faithful assistant, and she trusted him as she trusted herself, although there was no longer a soul in this world that Rickezia could trust even for an ounce. Hata told all the details of what he had managed to find out and exclaimed that he had a brilliant plan. Rickezia looked at the assistant with curiosity and asked what he meant. Then Hata exclaimed that he would disguise himself as the director of the orphanage and meet the count in person. He thought it was the perfect way to get closer to the counts, but Rickezia simply replied that she would not. Rickezia slowly rose from her chair and explained that, in that case, Hata would not be able to get the information he needed. The dogman looked at his mistress sadly and asked what they would do then. Rickezia looked at Hat and said she had a better idea. The girl said she would turn into a child herself and go to Count Basilion's family, where she would personally figure everything out. Hata, frightened, covered his face with his hands and said that it was too dangerous and that he shouldn't risk his life like that. But Rickezia just shrugged it off and said that it wasn't the first time she had taken such a risk. Rickezia added that, as everyone knows, the servants of the Basilian family are extremely loyal and know how to keep their mouths shut, fearing for their own lives and the lives of their family, so the best way is to get to their estate herself. Rickezia said that she couldn't miss this opportunity because she had finally come across the trail of those who destroyed her happy life, so she was ready to take a risk and put her own life on the line. Rickezia's goal was to take revenge on those who ruined her carefree life. Her mother was a very powerful fairy who died right after Rickezia was born, and the girl inherited her power. Rickezia was left alone in the fairy world and only learned about her origins 5 years ago, on her 15th birthday, which she celebrated in an orphanage. The children and the director of the orphanage treated the little girl well, taking her in right after she was born and preparing a surprise birthday cake for her. She didn't know she was a fairy until her birthday. Rickezia simply enjoyed life in the orphanage, and although she did not have her own parents, the director and her close friends, who gave her love and care, instilled in the girl the belief that someone needed her. The girl who saw such a cake was incredibly happy and asked where they got it from, because they had big problems with money. But the director told the girl not to worry about such trifles and just enjoy the holiday. But the girl had no idea that her fairy powers would awaken on her 15th birthday. It was an inevitable process that happened right at the birthday celebration at the orphanage. During the awakening of the fairy's power, the room was filled with a bright glow, and everyone present asked Rechesia in fear if everything was okay. Although the girl herself did not know the answer to this question, the light was so bright that it radiated far beyond the building. At this time, several fairy hunters near the orphanage were observing this glow and exclaimed that the information turned out to be true and were already calculating how much they could get for selling the newly awakened fairy. The leader of the hunters lit a torch and shouted that it was time to start the hunt. In the human world, fairies and other magical creatures were nothing more than goods, and the hunters, wanting to get a good deal, attacked the orphanage. Rashizia died in the fire. She herself did not understand how she managed to escape certain death, and only later, when the girl grew up, did she learn that it was the power of the fairy that helped her survive. The girl sobbed at the burning place for several days, blaming herself for the death of all her loved ones. She thought that if her fairy power had not awakened, they would all have survived. So she lost everything she had. Life on the run was terrible. She had nowhere to go. The girl needed strength to survive. So in those terrible days, Rashizia understood and realized a lot. Rashizia made her choice and decided to master the power of the fairy to perfection. The girl hoped that this would be the only way to deal with the murderers of innocent children from the orphanage. She began her hunt with ordinary informants who worked for the fairy hunters. The terrified man, at the mere sight of Rashizia, swore that he had obtained everything Rashizia demanded and begged for mercy. Rashizia skillfully lowered her magic axe a millimeter from the man's leg and shouted loudly that he could get away. The man decided not to test her patience and, getting to his feet, ran as fast as he could. When Rashizia learned to control her power, the fairy hunters became nothing to her. So she began to search for those who destroyed her happy life, wanting only revenge. The fairy hunters were just pawns, and the girl understood that there had to be those behind them. She was not going to forgive her offenders. And that is how Rashizia became the most famous thief. After several years of searching, Rashizia managed to learn that her own mother was being treacherously used in experiments, which ultimately drove the powerful fairy mad. Rashizia also managed to learn that it was from her mother that she inherited incredible power, thanks to which she managed to become the most powerful fairy in the empire. Painstaking work and thorough research did their job, and the fairy learned that one of the most powerful noble houses of the Palin Empire was conducting cruel experiments on fairies. Rashizia couldn't just attack the aristocrats, so she looked for a way to get as close to them as possible. And finally, she managed to find one. But she hesitated because it was the Basilian family. The Basilian belonged to one of the three most powerful aristocratic families of the Palenque Empire. Little was known about them, as they were the most mysterious of the families. Almost no one knew what the head of the family, Count Kirin, looked like, and the entire family led a reclusive lifestyle. A few years ago, the Count's wife died, and an heir was chosen from among his 3 sons. That was all that was known about the Basilian family. They were the most suspicious to Rasenza. Count Basilian already had 3 sons, so Rashizia wondered why he needed to take another child, especially not from the nobility, but from an orphanage. Something was very suspicious here. Rashizia guessed that the Count might want to take the child for experiments. Hata insisted that it was quite dangerous, and he was categorically against Rashizia risking her life. But Rashizia reminded her assistant of the promise he had made to her. Hata sighed in despair and agreed to prepare a potion that would turn Rashizia into a child. The fairy smiled and asked her assistant to turn her into a 10-year-old child so that it would be easier for her to gather information. Rashizia knew that the Count himself was to come to the orphanage, and she wanted more than anything in the world to infiltrate Basilian's family. But when the fairy found herself in the body of a 5-year-old girl named Chesha, she already regretted this idea. The girl thought that perhaps Hata had overdone it, and his potion had turned her into a 5-year-old girl instead of a 10-year-old. But what made her even angrier was that she had been in the shelter for almost a month, and Count Basilian had still not shown up. Rashizia wasn't going to be in this pigsty, because the orphanage she remembered from childhood was much cleaner and always had delicious food there. Unlike the place where she found herself now, Rashisia watched her teachers closely and realized only one thing. Everyone didn't give a damn about the children who were in the orphanage, and the only thing they cared about was how to make more money. Even more annoying to Rakasia were the children who were in this shelter and who constantly insulted the little girl. Therefore, she was already seething and demanded that Count Bazilian visit the shelter as soon as possible. Finally, the girl heard the conversation of her peers, who were loudly exclaiming that an aristocrat had arrived in a very beautiful carriage. The governess loudly ordered all the children to go out into the living room. Hearing this, the girl cheered up a little, because she finally had hope that Count Vasilian would finally come to this God-forgotten place and she would manage to get to his estate. Looking out the window, Reticia noticed the elegant carriage, the well-groomed horses, and the elegant servants. She immediately had the hope that today she would finally meet the head of the Basilian family. A tall, black-haired man emerged from the carriage. His red eyes were both terrifying and mesmerizing at the same time, so the fairy could not tear her gaze from them. It was the head of the Basilian family, Count Kern. The Count had barely entered the orphanage when he declared authoritatively that he wanted to adopt the child. Rakesia knew that this man belonged to one of the three aristocratic families of the Polensk Empire. Rashisia couldn't believe her luck, so she was so happy that she almost jumped on the spot. However, the fairy decided not to reveal herself ahead of time and watched what would happen next. The director of the asylum began to circle around the famous aristocrat, trying to please him, so she invited the count to sit down and ran to prepare tea for the honored guest. Rashisia kept her eyes on him and noted that she felt somewhat uncomfortable. The girl thought that perhaps this was because she had waited too long for him to appear. The count told the director that his choice wouldn't take long, so there was no need to make tea. Kern said he would inspect the children from here and began scanning them with his gaze. A little girl standing behind her tried to push her way through the crowd of children, deciding she needed to get Count Bazilian's attention. She whispered to the other children from the orphanage to move aside if they didn't want to die. After examining the children for a few minutes, Count Kern turned around and said that no one was coming to him, so he had to go. The headmistress hurried after him, telling him not to rush and to examine the children more carefully. Rashisia thought that Kieran was rather impatient and was afraid that with his haste she would lose the chance to get to his estate, so she shouted loudly for him to wait. Rashisia grabbed the first thing she could find and started waving the loaf, shouting for him to take it with him. She mentally noted that she wasn't going to miss this chance, especially since she had been waiting for it for a whole month. Nevertheless, Rashisia got her way, and Count Kieran turned his attention to her. He turned and, looking at the girl, asked her why he had taken her from the orphanage. Rashisia boldly replied that she didn't immediately understand why he had to take her, and explained in night that she was so small. Faya noted that she might not have another opportunity like this. Rashisia understood that Count Kieran specifically emitted a murderous aura that made all the children in the shelter tremble with fear. The girl was convinced that the Count was looking for a child who was not afraid of him. The girl immediately understood that the Count needed the bravest child from the orphanage, who would not tremble before him, so Rashisia stood confidently in front of him on her little legs and looked him straight in the eyes. The Count was naturally impressed by the little girl's courage, so he knelt down in front of her and asked her what her name was. Rashisia thought that her plan had worked, and now the Count was hooked. The girl said that her name was Chesha, deciding to follow the invented legend to the end. The Count carefully examined her from head to toe, and then thoughtfully said that she was very similar. Rakasia did not immediately understand what the Count meant. After a few minutes, Count Bazilian made his choice and lifted the girl high in his arms. He looked at her again and solemnly declared that he would take this particular child from the orphanage. Kieran's red eyes fascinated the little girl, and he gently said that from now on he would be a father to Chesha. Rashisia shuddered at such a lightning-fast change in the Count's mood. The headmistress smiled with satisfaction that such a respectable man had taken the child from her shelter and led them to the carriage. When they were alone, Rashisia felt uncomfortable sitting on Count Bazilian's lap. Rashisia tried to settle down more comfortably and fidgeted on his lap. Such excitement of the little girl was noticed and played by Kern, who said that it was not surprising because she had not yet had time to get used to him. And then Count Basilian took out a box and said that his father had prepared something as a gift for Cheshire and handed her some beautiful bracelets. The girl immediately realized that this was some kind of trap because Kieran did not look like a person who gives gifts. Rashizia immediately realized that it was a magical artifact of control. And Count Basilian turned out to be not so simple, because he wanted to check 100% whether Rakisia had turned into a child. The clever fairy had drunk the potion of the beast Manhwa the day before, and it was impossible to expose her, because the power of beastmen was different from magic. Therefore, she smiled and thanked her new daddy for the valuable gift. The girl happily put the beautiful bracelets on her hands and looked into Count Basilian's eyes. She wanted him to feel like a real fool for putting a control artifact on an innocent child. Count Kieran smiled tightly and took the enchanted bracelets off the girl. He put them back in the box and said that he had made a mistake with the gift, and he would give her the real bracelets a little later. Richazia breathed a sigh of relief, noting that she had successfully passed the first stage of the check, and the new father smiled at the girl and told her that she could ask him for anything she needed. The girl asked hesitantly if she could really ask for anything she wanted. The count assured her that he would do anything for his daughter, but she would have to fulfill one small request in return. Kieran moved close to the little girl, took her face in his sturdy hands, and looked into her eyes. The count said that there was nothing difficult about it, that it was only an easy task. His words sent shivers down Richisia's spine. And she realized that the count definitely had some ulterior motive. The fairy began to suspect that the Basilian family was actually conducting experiments on fairies, but the count had no time to say what he wanted from her when the carriage suddenly stopped. The holy knights knocked on the window and said that the further journey would take place only after they had checked the documents. Count Basilian asked, displeasedly, what was the matter and what this sudden stop was connected with. The knights reported that they were now trying to find the thief, Rashizia. The fairy herself blinked her eyes in surprise. The fairy thought to herself that it had been a month since her disappearance, and the holy knights were still trying to find her. She admitted that she had managed to do quite a bit of work, but checking everyone's documents was too much. Kieran thoughtfully said that the devil Rakisia had indeed not appeared for a long time. Then the fairy looked at the count in surprise and realized that he had also been following her and was aware of all the latest events in her life. The knights insisted that Count Basilian show them his documents, and Kieran only replied with displeasure that he did not want to do so. Then the knights pointed out that they could not let him pass any further and ordered him to get out of the carriage. But to their proposal, the count also replied that he was not going to get out of the carriage, and Rikesia became curious about how he would solve this problem. Suddenly, she noticed that the knights suddenly froze, like statues. Kieran continued to speak in a monotone voice that he didn't want anyone to know that the Basilian family had adopted a child from the orphanage. So he ordered the knights to forget about this meeting forever. The knights were immediately enveloped in a magical glow of dark purple, and Rikesia realized that this was how black magic worked. The men immediately said that they would forever forget about this meeting and never mention it again. Black magic was forbidden in the empire, and it was a complete surprise to Richetsia that one of the great aristocratic houses was using forbidden magic. Then Count Kieran looked at the little girl and apologized to Cheshire for having to see this. He noted that if those knights had not stopped them, they would have been home long ago. Count Basilian then said that he could easily fix it with a snap of his fingers. With that, the carriage rose into the air, and a second later stopped in front of the Vasilian family's vast estate. Ricisia looked at her new house with interest and wondered how the count managed to move to another place in a second. The fairy assumed that black magic was involved here. Ricisia realized that Kieran was no longer shielding his power from her. She looked with interest at the huge castle, which was guarded by 100 armed knights, and concluded that it was almost impossible to get there. The count walked to the door and opened it authoritatively. He invited the little girl to come inside, saying that he was glad to welcome his daughter to the snake castle. The heavy rain made it difficult to see, but the man continued to run, because he understood that if he stopped even for a moment, he would be caught immediately, so the thirst for life drove him further and further. But the Inquisitor's silver cross still caught up with him, despite the man's desperate attempt to escape. One blow and the fugitive was already lying on the ground, choking on his own blood, while a young man in white robes approached him from the darkness. A tall, silver-haired man with blue eyes stepped closer to the captured man and looked him in the eyes. It was Hylon, the Inquisitor of the Holy Empire of Hildern. The fugitive was terrified and asked Hylon who he was. The Inquisitor introduced himself and calmly said that the fugitive should have known what would happen to him if he had decided to use the forbidden power. The Inquisitor dealt with the fugitive in a moment, and at that moment his subordinates ran up to him and turned to Hylon. Hylon raised his eyes with curiosity and looked at the knights, asking if they had really found the devil. But the holy knights rolled their eyes guiltily and explained that they still hadn't been able to find Rickesia, and although they had set up checkpoints throughout the empire, no information had yet been received. Hylon gripped his silver cross tighter and repeated, as if spellbound, that no information was coming in. The red-eyed beauty appeared again in his memories, who had pinned Hylon down and told him that he was now her prey. Helog looked dreamily at the starry sky and asked where Rickesia had disappeared to. He had been trying to find her for a month, but all his efforts had yielded no results, and this uncertainty was already starting to drive him crazy. At this time, Count Kern was putting his daughter to bed and said that today Daddy would also be with her all night. The girl pursed her lips and said that it was fine, although in reality she was already annoyed by such excessive attention from Count Vasilyevna. For a week, Rickesia had been staying at Count Basilion's family estate, and Kieran had not left her side. Wherever he went, he always took his daughter with him, so Rickesia had no chance to be alone. The fairy dreamed of only one thing: to get rid of this cursed child's body as soon as possible, because of it, she could do nothing to advance the investigation. The only thing she was sure of was that Count Kieran was hiding something. In this world, where religion was of great importance, black magic was under the strict control of the Holy Empire of Hildern. The Palestine Empire was also heavily influenced by the church, so black magicians were immediately executed on the spot. Count Basilian was a very powerful black magician who could easily control minds, so it became clear to Rickesia that Count Kieran could easily avoid death, and this did not bother her at all. Rickesia understood that no normal person would use black magic at the risk of their own life. Therefore, she was sure that Count Kieran was up to something very dangerous. Kieran noticed that the girl couldn't sleep, so he suggested singing her a lullaby. Rickesia turned away and thought that it would be better if Kieran showed his true colors, and not played this cheap theater where he was a good dad. And while the fairy was pondering her next steps, she heard Count Basilian actually begin to sing. This made her even more angry, because he couldn't hit a single note, so she barely restrained herself from telling her father to shut up. Rickesia thought it would be better if her own mother sang this song to her. The girl remembered almost nothing from her life in the orphanage, but she remembered her mother's lullaby as if it were only yesterday. Rickesia's eyes began to close, and in a moment she fell asleep. In the morning, she heard her father's voice asking if she had slept well, and the fairy was left wondering how he had managed to put her to sleep so quickly yesterday. Rickesia cursed and thought that because of that damned small body, even her stamina had become so meager that she was beginning to lose control of her strength. Meanwhile, Count Basilian came to the window. Then Kern took the girl in his arms and went out onto the balcony. He said that he had surprises for his daughter and that she would see him with her own eyes now. Rickesia looked out at the street with curiosity. The fairy noticed 3 young men walking through the yard, and Kern said that the Cheshi brothers had returned to the estate today. Rickesia thought that she knew almost nothing about the young Vasilians. The fairy knew only what everyone else knew about Kieran's sons, that the eldest was 13 years old, and his 2 younger twin brothers were only 11. The father looked at the girl and suggested that she go to the study to work. Rickesia nodded her head in agreement and thought to herself, why the hell was he constantly dragging her around? Because she needed to be left alone. When Count Basilian had seated his daughter at his desk, he began to gather himself and, taking his sword from its hiding place, said that he needed to be away for a while and asked his daughter if she would behave herself without him. Rickesia promised her father that she would be a good girl and thought to herself that she would finally be left alone and would have the opportunity to conduct her investigation which is why she signed up for this adventure of reincarnation into a child's body. There was a knock on the door, and the father allowed him to enter. A tall young man with black hair and red eyes entered. It was Count Basilion's eldest son, Belzion Basilion. The Count welcomed his eldest son back and asked if he had noticed anything unusual. Benzion cast a cold glance at the little girl and reminded his father that it was time for him to head for the Black Forest. Kir noted that this was exactly where he was going, and Rashizia could not understand why her older brother reacted so much to the appearance of an unknown girl on the family estate, and was even more interested in the Count's trip to the Black Forest. The Black Forest was a place where no sunlight penetrated. It was said that monsters lived there, and strange things were constantly happening. Few people wanted to go there. The Snake Palace itself was located in the Black Forest, which added to the mystery of the Basilian family that lived there. Meanwhile, the eldest son of Kieran turned and headed for the exit, and his father, stopping him, asked if the girl looked like him. Belzion said over his shoulder that he understood that his father had long since lost his mind and asked not to involve other people in this. Feya noted that the relationship between father and son was very tense, which hardly resembled a close one. Count Basilion looked at the girl and asked with a smile if she was afraid of her older brother, because he was usually very cold. Rickesia, smiling, replied that everything was fine. Kern patted his daughter on the head and said that he had to go and would not return until tomorrow morning, so tonight she would sleep without him. She only nodded silently, but when the Count headed for the exit, she ran to catch up with him. When the fairy called the Count, she asked him who she looked like. She had been interested in this question for a long time, but if she had asked it earlier, it would have been quite suspicious. And now a good opportunity arose. The first time the girl noticed that the Count had noticed her resemblance to someone else in the orphanage, but then she was afraid to ask about it. And now, when Count Vasilian emphasized this for the second time, the fairy guessed that he had adopted her not by chance. Rashizia was very eager to find out what her new father was up to, so she waited impatiently for his answer. But Kern, kneeling before the girl, said that he would definitely tell her when he returned from the Black Forest. The Count also said that she must wait for him and behave herself well. Finally, he added that they would see each other later and headed for the exit. The girl waved her hand at him and promised to be obedient. Rikishizia knew for sure that Count Kieran was hiding something and mentally told him not to count on the fact that his new daughter was a complete fool, and that today was the day when she would learn all the secrets of the Vasilian family. The fairy decided to use her magic to quickly gather all the useful information and get out of here as quickly as possible. But suddenly, the girl heard someone's step and decided to postpone it for later. Suddenly, someone quickly crept up behind her and covered her mouth with their hand. It was so unexpected that Rachizia didn't even have time to react, so all she could do was wait until she had some chance to choose from this mess. The man whispered angrily that it was better for the girl to go with him on good terms, and if she only complained, he would kill her on the spot. When the man took the girl out into the street, she saw his accomplice, who asked why he was taking so long. The men were shouting that they needed to hurry and that they were very pleased that they had managed to find this damn girl, asking each other why Count Vasilievna needed to take her away at all. One of the men threw the girl into a cart full of flowers and cursed that he had to search almost the entire estate to find her. The other noted that there was nothing special about this girl. The kidnappers looked at the little girl with curiosity and wondered who she looked like. Her golden hair and red eyes clearly reminded them of someone, but they couldn't remember who exactly. Then, looking more closely, one of them exclaimed that this girl looked a lot like the damn Richetsia, who had been missing for a month. As soon as they realized who she looked like, they took a couple of steps back. Rashizia surveyed her opponents and decided that she could deal with these weaklings in a matter of seconds. She was, of course, upset that she had been recognized, but there was nothing unusual about it, because her appearance was very expressive, even in the body of a child. The fairy decided that it was not worth leaving her captors alive, and began to activate her magical power, preparing to attack. Suddenly, she heard a male voice asking what they were doing here. A handsome young man with blonde hair and red eyes was walking towards them. It was Ishuel Vasilian, the third son of the Vasilian family, who told the men that he was seeing them for the first time, so they probably weren't locals. The men stammered and began to explain that they were flower sellers and had come here only to deliver the goods. But now they were in a big hurry and would not detain the young gentleman any longer. But the young man walked past the confused men and told them to shut up, because he himself would figure out what was going on and why. Looking into the cart with flowers, among which was a little girl, Ishuel exclaimed that there were more than just flowers here. Ishuel approached the girl and began to examine her closely. He said that she was incredibly beautiful, and that until today he had never seen anyone more beautiful than her. Rakisha thought that Ishuel was that Narcissus. Basilion's third son touched her cheek and asked why she wasn't crying if she had just been kidnapped. He thought she was quite strange, and Rakisha, looking at him, thought that no one had allowed this fool to touch her. The kidnappers decided not to waste any time and, while the young man was distracted by the girl, to finish them both off. They quickly took out their weapons and attacked the young man from behind. Before the kidnappers could strike, Ishwel used his magical power and the kidnappers were killed instantly. The young man said he wanted to wait until the girl cried, but they left him no other choice. After dealing with the kidnappers, Ishwel approached the girl and covered her with his umbrella, so that she would not be affected by the magic he used, and she would remain safe and sound. Rachazia, in the eyes again, smiled and admitted that she was not crying yet. Then he thoughtfully asked when this little one would cry. Taking the little girl in his arms, the third son of the family, Vasilian, said that the danger was over and they would return to the estate right away. Rachazia thought that everyone in this family was a total psychopath. The eldest son, Basilian, who was burdened with the burden of being the heir to a famous aristocratic family, spent all his free time in his office, trying to deal with paperwork. There was a knock on his office door, and Belzion looked up in annoyance. When the door opened, he saw his brother Ishuel standing there, holding the hand of a girl from the shelter. Ishuel picked up the girl and asked his older brother if he had ever seen such a beauty. He sat her down at the table with his brother and asked if Belzion wanted him to leave her there. After examining the girl, Belzion asked Ishwel why he decided to save her. The fairy, meanwhile, wondered if they really knew that she had been kidnapped and had not expected such indifference from her older brothers. Ishuel poked his finger in the little girl's face again and asked, "Isn't it cool to have such a little sister? Especially since she was so brave that she didn't even cry, so she was a perfect fit for their family." Belzion admitted that it would be quite difficult to come to terms with another girl on their estate. Ishuel confirmed his older brother's fears, but still noted that they would have much more fun with her. Then Belzion looked seriously at his younger brother and asked if he really wanted to take part in their father's crazy plan. Ishuel, smiling, said that he was no longer sure of his answer. It was obvious that the third brother really liked the little girl and tried to touch her as often as possible. In addition, he said that he wouldn't mind having a younger sister like her. Belzion also examined the unfamiliar girl and said that she was quite strange, and then, in all seriousness, asked her if she was ready to escape from this place, and if so, then he could help her with it. Rachazia thought with fear that she had managed to enter the estate with such difficulty that she was not going to leave it without finding out anything. She asked Belzion aloud if this was her house. Belzion looked at the girl in surprise and asked if she really liked it here, and if so, why. He himself was curious as to why this strange girl didn't want to run away from here. The question was quite unexpected for the fairy, and for a second she even wondered what she could say to make her older brothers finally get over her. So, smiling, she said that her daddy was very kind. The brothers looked at each other in surprise. Belzion noted that she was definitely not under magical control at the moment, and Ishuel added that the girl had assured them that their father was kind, so there was no doubt about her strangeness. Then Belzion decided to open the girl's eyes to their father and seriously asked if she even knew what Count Basilian was going to do to her. Ishuel also waited for an answer from the girl from the shelter. Ishuel told his older brother that he knew about his father's terrible plan to resurrect the dead. Rachazia hung on every word of their conversation with fear, trying to figure out what was being said. Life and death were in the hands of the gods, and everyone knew it. Therefore, to participate in the resurrection of the dead was an open challenge to the gods themselves, and for this one had to pay a rather high price. Even the most evil black magicians knew about this taboo, Rickesia already knew that Count Basilian was a rather powerful black magician, but she had no doubt that he understood the consequences of his plan. Belzion approached the girl and told her younger brother that he was against sacrificing children. After that, everything inside Rickesia cooled down, because she realized that it was her count who was going to be sacrificed. Belzion said that he also does not intend to participate in this terrible ritual, so he does not recommend that his younger brother sign up for this crime. It was obvious that Belzion wanted to add something more, but his father's voice interrupted him. The children turned to the door in fear and saw Count Basilian enter the room and greet those present. Kieran looked at his sons and asked his adopted daughter, with a smile on his face, what his beloved children were discussing here without their beloved daddy. The fairy remembered the love story of Count Basilian. About 15 years ago, Count Kieran fell in love with a woman of incredible beauty whom he met in the Black Forest near his family estate. It was like a story from a good fairy tale. No one knew for sure where this mysterious woman came from, and her identity remained a mystery. But Count Basilian fell madly in love with her. He even asked the emperor to grant the woman a noble title so that he could marry her. As soon as the simple formalities were over, Count Basilian married this woman and they had 3 sons. They lived happily ever after, and everyone thought it would be so forever. But unexpectedly, the countess died. The cause of death was unknown, and none of the doctors could help the woman recover. After the death of his wife, the count, who had rarely left the castle before, became a recluse until he decided to adopt a daughter. Now the fairy understood that the girl he had adopted was needed by the count to resurrect his wife. Everyone knew that the count was very attached to the woman, and the fairy should have guessed this at once, as soon as she learned that he was a black magician. The fairy was left with only one question: why did Kern choose the girl from the orphanage so carefully if he only needed her to resurrect the dead? Meanwhile, Kern's eldest son gave his father a white handkerchief. Belzion pointed out that his father was tainted by the Black Forest and advised him to wipe his hands. Kern smiled and, while wiping his hands, said that he had noticed how his older brothers had already become friends with their younger sister. Looking at the girl, Count Basilian said that she must have been frightened to see him in this form, but he missed his Czechia so much that he came to her as soon as he returned from the Black Forest. Lifting his daughter in outstretched arms, he repeated her name. Rickesia immediately noticed that Count Basilian smelled of blood around him and that he was clearly out of his mind. Count Basilian leaned over the girl and whispered that he would never use her as a sacrifice, so she should not listen to the silly conversations of her older brothers, because her father only wanted one thing from his daughter. Rickesia became curious about what the count really wanted from her, so she asked him directly about it. She was counting on him to tell her the truth and finally make everything clear to her. With bated breath, Rickesia waited for Count Basilian's answer, and he, smiling, said that one of these days they should visit the Hildern Empire, and Chesha should bring a fairy crown for her father. It was said that the fairy queen created the crown to pay homage to the gods and presented it to the holy emperor. It was a sacred relic of the Hildern Empire, about which almost nothing was known. But what was definitely known was that only children under the age of 5, the holy emperor, and the fairy could touch this fairy crown. Everyone else had no access to this sacred relic. Since this thing was created by the Fae, who were considered heretics in the empire, there was constant debate over whether this thing should even be considered a sacred relic. In the end, after much debate, they decided to remove the fairy crown from the list of sacred relics and promised to give it to a child who showed piety at a prayer meeting. That was why the count had chosen the child from the orphanage so carefully, because he planned for her to be the one to participate in this gathering. Rickesia reflected that although she had heard of the fairy crown, she had never been interested in this relic. Kern really believed that this girl would win the meeting and give her father the fairy crown, so Rickesia was convinced that he would go all out towards this goal, although she had no intention of praying at all, and she had no desire to go to the Holy Empire of Hildern either, because the empire was home to a lot of holy knights and inquisitors, whom she didn't want to meet at all. But what scared Rickesia most was meeting the man with the blue eyes, with whom fate had already brought her together, because she understood that if they met, she would definitely not escape death. At night, Rickesia was worried about the question that she was a fairy and a heretic from the underworld, so the Holy Empire was her biggest weakness. Kern, who was a black magician, should also hate the Holy Empire, so she didn't understand what the hell this crown seemed like to him. Richezia decided to escape from here as soon as possible and return to her old life. She was of course glad that the Count had adopted her only for the sake of the prayer meeting and would not conduct experiments on her. And Richezia didn't like this idea, which concerned the crown of the Fairy Queen, and, deciding that her life was more important, she took out the hidden flower of invisibility and, using magic, ran down a long corridor. Holding a magic rose in her mouth, Richezia was purposefully moving towards the exit when she heard some man's footsteps behind her. The young man, seeing a rose petal, asked loudly where the smell of flowers came from. It was Count Basilion's second son, Karka Basilion. He picked up a red flower petal from the floor and examined it carefully. The young man could not understand where this thing had come from in their family castle. Rikisdasia understood that she was invisible to her second son, so she began to calm herself down. Although her heart almost jumped out of her chest, she cursed that this was all she needed and decided to run away from here as quickly as possible. The fairy, hiding behind the bushes, could barely catch her breath and could not understand where her second son Basilion had such phenomenal intuition. Because he was chasing her almost on her heels, and in her haste, she even lost her magic rose. Richezia was glad that she had finally managed to break away from Karka, and when she found herself in the courtyard, she figured that she only had a few steps left to take to freedom. But suddenly, the fairy saw that Karka was standing behind her. The girl forced a strained smile and greeted her new brother. Karka looked at her in surprise and did not understand how he had come across his new sister if he had been following a trail of rose petals all the way. The young man decided to deal with this later and asked the girl what she was doing in the garden so late. Richezia began to think that she had just decided to take a walk and accidentally got lost there. Then Karka handed her the magic rose of invisibility and said that he had found it on the way to this place, asking if this flower might belong to his younger sister. Richezia replied unequivocally that she had no idea where this rose came from. Then Karka carefully twirled it in his hands and said that it was strange because the flower smelled exactly like the girl. Richezia realized that she was almost exposed, so she began to worry that the boy would find out who she really was. Karha, meanwhile, simply asked her not to move and began to sniff the girl in a strange way. The fairy cursed that she would be exposed by an 11-year-old child and was about to say goodbye to life when suddenly they both heard a man's scream. Karka said seriously that an uninvited guest had visited them and, giving the girl a magic rose, took her in his arms. The young man said that they should also go to the gate and headed towards the sound of a man's voice. Count Kirin was already standing at the gate, listening as Count Rudan shouted that there was power, that an aristocrat could not behave like this, and that this was simply unheard of impudence on the part of Count Basilion. Kirin asked Count Rudan to speak more quietly, since it was already late at night outside, and advised him to simply deliver the royal decree, rather than strain his throat in vain. Then Count Rudan loudly announced that Count Basilion must immediately appear at the imperial palace, and that this was an order from His Highness. If Kirin did not obey the order, he would be recognized as a traitor. Then Count Rudan added that the Count's adopted daughter, Chesha Basilion, should also arrive at the imperial palace with Count Kern. Such an order clearly did not please the girl. Hearing the name of his adopted daughter, Count Basilion's expression suddenly changed, and he was ready to kill Count Rudan with just one look. He did not like it at all when anyone touched on the subject of his children. Richezia thought the imperial order was quite strange, as going to the capital in the middle of the night was quite dangerous, especially if you were dragging a little girl with you. Count Rudan quickly jumped onto his horse and shouted that if Count Basilion wanted to make it to the audience with the emperor on time, he would advise Kirin to set off immediately. Having said this, Rudan disappeared into the darkness of the night. Count Basilion, meanwhile, remained calm, and only said that Count Rudan obviously knew nothing about manners if he allowed himself to disturb a respectable aristocratic family in the middle of the night. Kirin also added that this was all he needed, because he was already worried about the disappearance of one young person, and, turning to the children, asked where his beloved daughter was. Rhosesia was surprised that Count Basilian had noticed her disappearance, as she had only been gone for a few minutes. Meanwhile, Kieran approached the girl and took her in his arms. The Count whispered in the girl's ear that he had been seriously frightened when he noticed that Chesha was not in the bedroom and was about to send the guard dogs out to look for her. From such unhealthy attention from Kern, Rhosesia felt uneasy. Count Basilian turned his attention to his son, who was standing nearby, and said that his daughter must have just been out with her little brother. Rhosesia was delighted by this explanation for her disappearance and happily said that was the case. Karka frowned the whole time as his father talked to his adopted daughter, and when his patience ran out, he shouted that his father was treating Chesha the same way he treated their mother. The second son also added that his father was flirting with the girl only because she looked like her late mother. Then Rhosesia realized who she was constantly being compared to, and it was the late Countess Vasilian. Rhosesia did not understand why Count Vasilian was so fond of her, since they resembled his late wife only in the color of her hair. The fairy's beauty was woven from witchcraft, and it was simply impossible for an ordinary person to repeat it. The father decided not to continue the conversation on such a delicate topic with his son, and simply said that they should immediately go to the imperial palace, especially since his daughter had already been found. The next morning, they arrived at the imperial palace and sat in the waiting room. Kieran noted that the palace was the same as before. Meanwhile, Rhosesia wondered what the hell she was constantly getting into, fearing that at this rate she might forget about escaping the castle. Rudin entered the living room, and Vasilian asked him when he would have an audience with the emperor. Count Rudin only said that Count Vasilian should be patient and wait a little. Then Count Rudin reported that before the important conversation with the emperor, Count Basilian had to meet with someone else, and noted that this man had just arrived at the imperial palace. A tall man with blue eyes entered the room. Count Rudin asked permission to introduce the Holy Knight Hildern and the Holy Empire Lord Hylon. In the Holy Empire of Hildern, they possessed the right of immediate execution and immunity from punishment, making them a powerful group, consisting of the highest spiritual knights after the Pope and the cardinals. The knights operated covertly across the continent to restore order. Among them, Hylon was the only one who could wield the sacred artifact, the Chain of Condemnation, and was therefore revered as proof of Hildern's holiness. While Rhosesia was a child, Hylon had been persistently pursuing her. The status of an inquisitor was classified information, and Rhosesia knew that they usually disguised themselves as holy knights, but she had no idea that she would encounter him here. Hylon did not take his attentive gaze off the little girl who was sitting next to Count Basilian, and Rhosesia, looking down, thought that this man must have recognized her in the little girl's account. Hylon no longer heard what Count Rudin was saying, and without taking his eyes off Rhosesia, headed towards her. Everything inside the girl turned upside down with fear, and she couldn't understand what the hell this psycho was heading towards her. Approaching the table, Hylon extended his hand to the girl, but Count Basilian firmly squeezed the Inquisitor's hand and asked what the Holy Knight needed from his adopted daughter. Hylon seemed to come to his senses and apologized to Count Basilian, explaining that this girl looked very much like one of his acquaintances. Count Basilian was surprised and asked who this 5-year-old girl could look like. Count Rudin almost fainted when he saw how Count Basilian behaved with Hylon, so he shouted for Kieran to watch his behavior, because Hylon belonged to the First Order of Holy Knights. Count Basilian smiled tightly and invited the Holy Knight to introduce himself, telling him his name. He knew that he was dealing with a difficult man, but he was not going to let him touch Chesha. Hylon also did not expect anyone to resist him, as he was not used to such an attitude, and, carefully examining Count Basilian, also introduced himself. Then Count Basilian asked what the Holy Knight was doing in the imperial palace, for he, having come such a long way here, thought he would spend time with His Highness. Hylon explained that it was he who had asked the emperor to summon the count here to confirm the identity of the child who wished to attend the sacred prayer meeting, and that he therefore wished to be left alone with the girl. Kern looked at Hylon in disbelief and asked why the Holy Empire needed to confirm the identity so suddenly. Hylon explained that it was to avoid any outside interference. Hylon added that the fairy crown was once a holy relic, so Count Basilian should have understood himself that he needed to be even more careful and asked Kieran to cooperate with them in a good way. Kieran didn't like it, of course, but he had no other choice, so he said he hoped it wouldn't happen again in the future. Approaching his daughter, he told her not to worry. Count Basilian told Cheshire to call her father immediately if anything happened, and whispered in her ear to remember everything he had told her about fulfilling just one of his wishes. Rishasia really didn't want to be left alone with Hylon, and she was worried, wondering where he would start his examination of her. But she was even more worried about the question of whether he would recognize her in the girl's body. The fairy, excited, lowered her eyes so as not to meet his gaze. Then she heard his footsteps and realized that he was approaching her. As she got closer, Hylon said that she really looked like him. The Inquisitor sat down in front of Rakesia on the viburnum, and looking at the girl, said that probably while he was away, a man had appeared to her. And perhaps it was then. While he muttered something under his breath, Rishasia tried to understand what kind of nonsense he was carrying. But then Hylon unexpectedly asked the girl if she was really the daughter of the devil Rishasia. It was so unexpected that the fairy almost lost consciousness, and Hylon did not take his eyes off her, waiting for the answer. The fateful bond between Rishasia and Hylon stretches back a long time. A chance meeting when they were still teenagers forever tied them together, even though they were on different sides of the barricades. When they first met, Rishasia was frightened and exhausted from constantly running from her pursuers. It was a turning point in the lives of both main characters. Hylon was at that time a young squire who held great promise for the future of the Sacred Empire. Then the girl asked him to kill her because she had already lost faith in her happy life. Of course, Hylon did not fulfill her request. After that brief meeting, time took its course and they went their separate ways. Fate decreed that one of them would become the hunter and the other the prey. But they were connected by some strong knots that were difficult to describe in words. And if one of them was destined to die, it was only at the hands of the other. Such was their strange relationship. Hearing the question about whether she was Rishesia's daughter, the fairy was indignant, because Hylon, like no one else, knew about her situation, and she was furious that he thought that the thief, Rishesia, had time to run around on dates with others. Hylon noticed that the girl was confused and, looking down, said with a doomsday expression that it seemed that he had asked her this question too soon. It was clear that the man was very upset, because he had already made up his mind about something. Hylon suggested that the girl start with her name and asked her what her name was. When he heard the answer, he asked if Cheshire was forced to attend prayer meetings. At first, Rakisia hesitated and then replied that they were not forcing her. Hylon explained that he was very concerned about this issue, because if she had to go there against her will, he could help her with this matter. Rachesia was naturally surprised by Hylon's suspicions, but simply replied that she didn't need his help. Hylon smiled and said he was glad to hear she was okay. Then Hylon decided to clarify the question about the little girl's mother, and asked if her mother had golden hair and red eyes, or if she had seen butterflies or flowers next to her mother. The Inquisitor insisted that the girl remember as much information as possible about her biological mother. The fairy only replied irritably that she did not remember anything. She was furious that Hylon was trying to find out everything about Richetsia. Hylon realized he had no other choice and slowly began to unbutton his shirt. Shocked Rachesia couldn't take her eyes off him and couldn't understand what the hell he was undressing. When Rachesia saw part of his shaved chest, she covered her face with her hands and began to scream loudly. She thought that Hylon was a crazy psycho and wished that it was all just a dream. But when the girl opened her eyes, she saw Hylon showing her a rose-shaped mark on his chest and understood what it was all about. Hylon asked if the girl had never seen this mark before, and Richisia at that time remembered how she herself had left it on Hylon's body. At the girl's scream, Count Basilian immediately came running, caught Hylon almost naked by surprise, and sternly asked if the Holy Knight was perhaps seeking death here. Kern was outraged that the Holy Knight of the Holy Empire, Hildern, would commit such indecencies in the presence of a 5-year-old child. Hylon tried to explain that he needed to clarify something with Cheshire. Kieran merely muttered that it was not necessary to undress in order to ask questions. But as Count Basilian drew closer, he noticed an unusual mark on the Holy Knight's skin. Smiling, Count Basilian said that it was the mark of the devil Rishesia, and asked Hylon why he didn't remove it, because Holy Knights usually even flay their skin just to get rid of the sign of heresy. Hylon guiltily began to dress and asked how Kieran knew about this sign. But Count Basilian only shouted that he would not allow his daughter to be questioned about the whereabouts of the devil while stripping naked. Kieran grabbed a candlestick and, bringing it close to the Holy Knight's neck, threatened to say that Cheshire had nothing to do with the devil Rickettsia, and asked Hylan not to test his patience any further. Kieran shouted that he hoped they would never see each other again. Rickettsia realized at this point that things were getting serious and was worried that they would not punch each other in the face. But Hylan said that each child who attended the prayer meeting would be assigned a night guardian, and for the Basilian house, Hylan was chosen for this role. Count Basilian only smiled irritably, and Hylan continued to say that he would ensure the safe escort of the Basilian family to the sacred empire of Hildern itself. Kieran only asked if Hylan would accompany them or follow them. The Holy Knight stood up and firmly told Count Basilian to think whatever he wanted, but advised him to continue to watch his actions. Hylan threatened that Count Wasmilian was already being watched. Therefore, as he left the room, the Inquisitor only said dryly that they would see each other on the day of departure to the Holy Empire. Kern said nothing. Rickettsia breathed a sigh of relief that Kieran had intervened in time, and that everything had ended quickly. But she was troubled by the question that Count Basilian not only knew the thief Rickettsia, but also knew what her personal brand looked like. Therefore, the fairy decided to wait a little longer before escaping from the Basilian family and decided to play along with Kierna. She also pursued the goal of finding out as much information as possible about this mysterious family. The girl stretched out her arms to Count Basilian and asked her father to take her in his arms. After taking the girl, Kieran seemed to calm down a little, and Rickettsia decided to take this opportunity and ask where he had been. Count Basilianus said that he had been in audience with the Emperor of the Plenke Empire. Kieran recalled how, upon seeing him, the Emperor apologized for having to summon him to his palace so unexpectedly. Count Kieran dryly replied that it was his duty to carry out the Emperor's orders. And then the Emperor asked if Count Basilian had already met the Holy Knight of Children. Count Basilian stopped in surprise. He only mumbled the words about the Holy Knight indistinctly, and then their full meaning finally began to dawn on him. The Emperor noticed that Count Basilian's face had changed and asked him what had happened. But Kieran sternly asked the Emperor to be more precise and began to quickly approach him. Approaching the Emperor, Kieran grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and indignantly said that this scumbag Hylan was a famous inquisitor, and asked the Emperor what the hell he had done to his inquisitor's daughter. The Count told his daughter, with a smile on his face, that he had not seen the Emperor for a long time, so he had come to greet him. And then the girl asked if she also needed to meet with His Highness. But Kieran only replied that she didn't need to meet that old man at all, and suggested that Cheshire see the imperial palace with her father. Rickettsia was surprised that Kieran could speak so highly of the Emperor. While walking through the incredibly beautiful imperial garden, Kieran said that the girl should immediately let her father know if she liked something, and he would immediately build exactly the same thing in their castle. Then Kieran asked his daughter what they had talked about with the Holy Knight. The girl smiled and said that Hylan had asked if she had a dog, and she had answered that she did, asking the Count if she had done the right thing. Count Basilian said that his daughter was a real good girl, and then asked if the Holy Knight had said anything strange to the girl. The fairy understood that Kieran was still worried about the incident that had happened in the waiting room. Rickettsia understood that her father was worried that Hylan would make her change her mind about participating in the prayer meeting, or that he was simply worried that people would start to think badly of the Basilian house. Rickettsia decided to raise the level of trust in their relationship and extended her hand to Count Basilian. She straightened his disheveled hair and said the word Dad. The fairy noticed that Basilian was confused while playing. The girl smiled and assured him that Cheshire would always be on his side, so he didn't need to worry about anything. Then Rickettsia was very surprised at how the Count had changed after her touch. In his eyes, the girl saw a completely different man, who was not only a black magician, but also a loving father. With eyes full of love, Count Kern looked at the little girl and only said mysteriously that she shouldn't be so similar. Then Rickettsia guessed that these words must have referred to his late countess. There were more than 3 months left until the sacred prayer meeting, and the Vasilian family decided to live in the capital until then, so they moved the whole family to their capital home. After meeting with the Emperor, Count Basilian began to leave the estate more often, and Rickesia constantly wondered what kind of person the Countess was, who had made the black magician fall so madly in love with her and do unimaginable things for her return. The fairy had hoped that she would be able to gather more information at the family estate, but because of the move, she decided not to sit idly by. Suddenly, Ishuel approached her and greeted his sister. Then Ishuel was joined by Karka, who asked how she was in the imperial palace and whether her sister had managed to pass the exam to get into the prayer meeting. Rickesia replied that she had. The brothers began to ask if she had eaten well, if she had slept well, and Rickesia sighed in despair, because she understood that although Kern was currently absent, these two brothers had decided to replace him. Belzin was watching them carefully. The Count's eldest son recalled that their family's peaceful life collapsed in one moment with his mother's sudden illness. Belzion constantly helped to care for her and spent all his free time with his mother. Then, before her death, the mother said that she had one request for her eldest son. The woman said that after her death, her father and his younger brothers would grieve for her very much, and she asked Belzion to protect them. With tears in my eyes, Belzion certain that he would do everything in his power and would certainly protect his relatives. Then his mother asked him for forgiveness for placing such a heavy burden on him, and with these words, the Countess left the world. The death of the Countess changed many things in the daily life of the Basilian family. The younger brothers constantly asked Belzion where their mother had gone, because they could not find her anywhere in the house. With tears in his eyes, Ishuel told Belzion that he was looking for his mother from yesterday, and his twin brother Karya could not smell either his mother or the child that was in her belly. For Belzion to watch his younger brothers, who still didn't know what death was, trying to find their mother. But he couldn't do anything about it. The only thing he could do was support his brothers. But the most terrible thing was that his father's condition was getting worse than the late Countess had predicted. The Count spent all his time by her coffin, not daring to bury his late wife. Count Basilian not only forgot about the affairs of the county, but also abandoned his 3 sons to their fate, sitting around the clock next to the body of his deceased wife, regardless of what the weather was like outside. Belzion tried to be with his father all the time and supported him as best he could. But his condition began to scare the boy more and more every day. So one day, Belzion asked his father to come to his senses, asking how long he was going to stay here. The boy said that his mother would not want his father to leave everything and sit by her coffin around the clock, so he asked the Count to come to his senses and come to the estate. But the Count continued to sit by the coffin, not reacting to his eldest son's words. There was a heavy downpour outside, soaking them to the skin. Belzion no longer knew how to put an end to this madness. Then Belzion shouted that the father had no right to give up, because he was the great Count Basilian, and no matter what happened, the Count could not forget his duty to his children and his county. Belzion reminded him that his father, like Count Basilian, had a duty to his family, the same as the serpent that rules the Black Forest. Hearing this, his father rose from the ground and began to laugh like a madman. That day, the Count remembered that he was Basilian and said over the coffin of his late wife that he could even resurrect the dead. This day was his downfall and the beginning of his madness. Now Belzion watched his foster sister and brothers through the window of his own study, pondering what to do next, because after the death of his mother, the Count had completely lost his mind. Being with his father, Belzion saw how a man who looked completely normal on the outside was constantly crumbling from the inside. And in the end, Count Basilian decided to cross the line and do the forbidden. Belzion watched this whole process from the very beginning, and one day the father, with a crazy smile, told his son that he had found a way for them to bring their mother back to life. Belzion decided to remain sane no matter what it cost him. He feared that his father's plan to use the fairy crown of the Holy Empire as a sacrifice to black magic would be exposed. Once that happened, the Basilian family would be immediately destroyed, and the innocent child they had taken from the orphanage would be executed as an accomplice. And Belzion was sure that his mother would not have wanted such an ending. Belzion thought about it. He couldn't think of a way to stop his father. He saw his brothers circling their foster sister and knew that the twins were already participating in this madness. Belzion was also very concerned that his new sister, who had recently arrived at the family estate, was getting used to everything very quickly. The eldest son thought that if his sister, whom his mother carried under her heart before her death, had survived and been born, she would have looked like the girl who was now walking in their garden. The boy did not understand why this girl was holding on to this place so much, and it began to annoy him very much. Suddenly, he heard his father's voice, who asked what Belzion was staring at so much, wondering if the eldest son had also begun to fall in love with his sister. Balzion turned around and displeasedly told his father not to sneak up like a robber, but to make himself known before entering his room. The boy noticed that the Count was ready to do anything to satisfy his dirty desires, even to use an innocent child. But the Count stopped his son, saying that he felt pure love for the girl. Belzion asked what his father was going to do next. The Count wondered what exactly the eldest son meant. Then Balzion explained that after the announcement of participation in the sacred prayer meeting, all attention would now be focused on the Vasilian county. It was because of this excessive attention that Vasiliana, who until now had constantly tried to hide in the shadows, would be forced to come out into the world, and the eldest son did not like this very much. Balzion advised his father that he would now need to expand his influence to other aristocratic families. Hearing this, Count Basilian smiled somewhat strainedly and said that he would definitely think about it. Count Basilian went to the window, and they stood side by side, looking into the garden, where at that time a little girl was walking, accompanied by her older brothers. But each of them was thinking about his own thing. Belzion knew that all his words would have no effect on his father, and he would not hear him anyway. He understood that Count Kiern's gaze was not directed at the future of the Basilian family, but at the dead past. The twin brothers were accompanying their foster sister at this time, suggesting that she look at the beautiful flowers or go sit somewhere. Richicia walked slowly ahead, wondering how she could get rid of these annoying boys. Belzion decided that he could not lose their family's future by dwelling on a dead past that could not be brought back, as he had promised his mother before her death. Therefore, looking into his father's eyes, Belzion boldly said that he would be willing to do absolutely anything to stop him before his father dared to break the taboo. Richesia was already used to the attention of her twin brothers, and understood that before she appeared on the estate, they were younger, but now they had the opportunity to feel like older brothers and were constantly circling around their sister. The fairy decided to play along with her brothers and gain their trust and support in case she ever needed it in the future. The only thing that bothered her was that she couldn't possibly begin her investigation. One day, the butler informed the twins that Belzion had ordered them to come to the drawing room immediately, as Count and Countess Rudin had come to their estate, and the brothers hurried to meet them with their younger sister. Entering the living room, Richesia immediately realized that this was the same man who had recently delivered the imperial decree in the middle of the night, and could not understand what the hell he was visiting them with today. The Count's wife immediately smiled at the children who entered the room and introduced herself. She said that she had received an imperial order to teach them etiquette, which was why she had arrived at their family estate. Count Rudin added that His Highness wished to welcome a new child to the Count's family in this way, and sent them to the Basilian family. Rudin advised them to consider it an honor, emphasizing that such an education would be worth receiving in advance. Rishizia immediately understood that they had been sent to the Basilian estate, most likely for surveillance, because last time the relations between the Emperor and Cyrnus had not been the warmest. Richesia looked at Belzion, who was barely holding back his emotions and trying to calmly drink tea with the distinguished guests, and realized that she was absolutely right in her guesses. Countess Rudin suggested that she start studying immediately with Mrs. Cheshire, and emphasized that the girl needed to study hard from that moment on, because she was the Count's daughter, and she was behaving like a homeless woman from the streets. Karka immediately took out his stick and, putting it to Countess Rudin's throat, asked the woman to watch her tongue, because they all heard perfectly well how she had just insulted their sister. Isuel also said that it was unpleasant for them to hear such words towards their younger sister, because they forced them to make the choice between killing the Count's Rudin immediately or not. The Countess almost fell unconscious, as she had not expected such an attack from the younger Basilian, and Belzion immediately shouted at the brothers, ordering them to stop immediately. The eldest son, Basilian, bowed his head and apologized for his younger brothers, citing the fact that they were still quite young. He expressed the hope that the Counts of Rudin would magnanimously forgive them for their rudeness. Count Rudin began to shout at the top of his lungs, asking what they were doing. He shouted that both the father and the children were equally tactless, and that this was obviously a family trait of the Vasilian family. The count asked what the hell Count Basilian had sent some ill-mannered scoundrels in his place, asking where he was, and why he hadn't met them in person. Belzin couldn't find anything to answer Count Rudin, Vasilian family nest, and said that this was always the case when children grow up without a mother. Count Rudin, taking his wife by the arm, led her to the exit and finally shouted that he would never forgive them for this and would not just give it away. The Rudin family left the living room, loudly slamming the door. Belzion stood with his head down, not knowing what to do after this incident. Ishuel immediately told his older brother that with just one word from him, he would deal with those ignorant people immediately. Belzion, without returning to his brothers, said that enough of these showdowns had been had. He did not want to further complicate relations with Count Rudin, because the incident had already gone far beyond acceptable limits. Belzion left the room, leaving the brothers with Chesha in his arms. Ishuel said that Count Rudin had insulted his brother and that he was probably very sorry now. But Karka pointed out that the woman was the first to start picking on their sister. The twin brothers began to consider whether they should catch up and kill the Count's Rudin. But then they decided that Belzion would be very angry with them if he found out, so they decided to leave the couple alive. Risuzia understood that because of this incident, the emperor would now have the opportunity to put a noose around Count Basilion's neck. This was, of course, a big problem, but an even bigger problem was that Rudin had hurt Belzion very much with his words about growing up without a mother.